Well, welcome to the week of April 7 through 11. We're off and running again. Just thought I'd sort of back up a little bit and go over where we are and where we've been. Uh, I assigned Ivan Illich last time, and that was a long read. I wonder whether all of you got through it. I suppose if you'd be in on-campus class, my guess would be not everybody got all the way through. But I do want you to make sure that you read it and that you get some understanding of what we're up to here. And what we're up to is showing some writers who are Christians and how they approach bringing their faith into their fiction, in this case, into their writing or into their art. Um, a teacher told me that at Unity not long ago you had a speaker who talked about actually having killed someone in a drunken stupor or whatever, and then understanding after that happened some of his own foibles and difficulties. That kind of testimony is not unusual, but it's much more common to have somebody who just gets really drunk or does something bad, but a murderer is really something. Anyway, what you need to understand about Illich, and one of the reasons I think a lot of you felt that it just went on and on and on, which I understand, is that what we're dealing with there is a testimony that comes from a whole different root or source, and that source is, of course, conventionality. In other words, Illich really never did anything wrong. Now, he may have fallen out of love with his wife, but that happens in half the marriages that go on today. But the fact of the matter is he didn't kill anyone. He didn't really do any of the kinds of sins that we might think of as being the ones that lead to all kinds of dissolution and horror. His sin really was almost his conventionality. In other words, he had done everything according to the world's sensibility. And he's much like, therefore, the biblical story of the rich young ruler. The difference being, of course, no one says to him at the end, give all you have to the poor. On the other hand, the people who serve him best are children and the servants. And these are people who have no political favors to gain from him whatsoever. They serve him really out of love and a sense of duty. But somebody asked, what does the line mean? Death, there is no death, or something like that. That's almost biblical, right? Death, where is thy sting? Death, thou shalt die. Death is over. And what happens to Ivan Illich is that he slowly, and that's why Tolstoy is known as what we call a psychological realist, because he takes us through all of these steps in order to try to help us understand what ultimately happens to him, which is, of course, ultimately not any difference in what happens to Flannery O'Connor protagonists, and that is they come to faith. The difference is, of course, in O'Connor's Catholicism, often people have to get knocked on the head by murderers or ugly college students with throwing books. That doesn't happen here. Inside Tolstoy's mind, the soul's own progress moving towards a sense of redemption is what brings him there. So anyway, Tolstoy, late 19th century, Russian, really, really a world classic, that short story, in part because of the fact that it documents so thoroughly what happens to us ultimately when we die. Trust me, my own parents died. I know, from the inside what happens to people when they die, and it's not pretty, and it is always alone, even though you're sitting at the bedside, as I did with my father and with my mother-in-law. They're very much alone, and that's the story here. This is a story of the kind of redemption that occurs when one realizes there is nothing but grace to rely upon, and that's what the story is about. Okay, so anyway, this week we jump to much more contemporary stories. The first one is by Andre Dubus, who is also Roman Catholic. And you'll find that out. You need to know some things about Roman Catholicism. You need to know, for instance, that the Roman Catholic Church is anti-birth control, which means, of course, that people Well, yeah, in order for people to have sex, they have to do it on a rhythm so that the rhythm alleviates the potential or eliminates the potential for pregnancy if they want to control birth. If they don't, of course, you can have dozens and dozens of children. But in the relationship which the narrator has with his wife, and it's not a good relationship, you need to understand that many times students don't sort of get that there are difficulties were in part created by a church who had very definite views about birth control and how to go about that. That's a small part of the story. It just is something which kids don't frequently understand, because the students that I usually have are Protestant. So he's a Catholic writer again. But what's unique and interesting about A Father's Story is that this guy, who's by anyone's measure not a saint at all, talks to God, and it happens in the story. Now, is he actually talking to God, or is he talking to some alter ego? I don't care to play theological games with you, but there is a sense in which his communication with God is very thorough and very strong and very convincing in its own right. It is a story, so it's fiction, and it didn't necessarily happen. Do we buy into it? I hope we do, and we do on the basis of the fact that it lets us so clearly into the world of this man, the narrator. He's one. Debus is one. Debus is gone. He died not so long ago. I should really talk about how he died, which is terribly interesting in terms of the story itself, but we'll get there. And then two others, much, 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 much more contemporary, writers who are significantly younger than I am and are publishing quite a bit. One is Gina Ochsner, who's from Oregon. And Ochsner writes in the form of magic realism. And she takes magic realism really from biblical sources. In other words, what happens in the Bible is Joshua holds up his hands and the sun stops. What happens is there's a guy riding a donkey in order to do prophetic work somewhere else or running away, and the donkey turns around and talks to him and says, "Get off my back, you jerk." The story of Balaam, you know. She says these things are regular occurrences in biblical literature, and they are. And they're also regular occurrences in a lot of third world countries where psychological realism, as in Tolstoy, simply doesn't happen, but magic happens in ways that are sort of stunning. And Gina's uses magic realism. It's a short story, much easier to read, an odd story. I would guess you'll sort of like it. It's strange. And then finally, there's Jamie Quattro. Her husband used to teach at Dordt. Came out with a book of short stories last year, which got all sorts of wonderful accolades. And her story is a little bit more in the O'Connor tradition, especially with grotesques. In other words, characters who somehow are bigger than life. It's still very real, but it really, really is also kind of exaggerated. But we're looking again for how do writers of faith bring their faith into the fabric of literature that is not meant for a Christian bookstore, but instead meant for a much more literate audience. I shouldn't say it that way, but an audience that isn't looking necessarily to literature to reinforce their faith. These are writers who are not going to be in the bookstore, in the mall, in Sioux Center. They're different kinds of writers. They're literary writers who have a larger market than simply evangelical Christians who are looking for ways to improve or enhance their own faith image. So that's it for this week. I'm going to be gone from Wednesday through Friday and Saturday. We're going to Michigan to a conference on faith and literature, and with tons of other Christian writers. And some that aren't necessarily Christian writers. Anyway, I'll try to be a little bit more prompt this week in getting back to you, but don't look for much, although I will be able to stay online. It's at a strange college. You may have heard its name, Calvin. I think they have computers there. I'm not sure. Anyway, I hope this week is easier for you. Last week with Illich, wow, that was a long story. It took me hours to go over it again, and I worried about you. Anyway, I'll see you again next week as we continue in this vein. Okay? Bye-bye.